The autumn evening was settling in, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple as Dr. Lee pulled his sleek, midnight blue Mercedes S-Class onto Oakwood Avenue. The car's leather seats still had that new car smell he'd grown to love over the past few weeks. After performing 2 complex heart surgeries and handling multiple consultations, his mind was focused on nothing but getting home to his family and a warm meal. The prestigious Highland Park neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional dog walker or jogger passing by the magnificent houses with their perfectly manicured lawns. Dr. Lee had called this neighborhood home for the past 5 years, ever since accepting the position as head of cardiothoracic surgery at Metropolitan General Hospital. As he carefully navigated the gentle curves of the tree-lined street, he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first. Police regularly patrolled this upscale area. But after 3 turns, the cruiser remained behind him, matching his every move. Dr. Lee double-checked his speed and signaling, knowing he was driving perfectly within the limits. His heart sank when the red and blue lights finally flashed to life, their harsh glow bouncing off his side mirrors. 15 years of medical training, thousands of saved lives, and countless hours of community service, yet none of that mattered in moments like these. He'd been here before, and the familiar knot in his stomach returned as he carefully pulled over, positioning his car precisely 3 feet from the curb. Following the procedure he'd learned years ago, he turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and took slow, measured breaths. The surgical precision that served him so well in the operating room now helped him maintain his composure. Through his side mirror, he watched Officer Taylor approach, his hand hovering near his weapon. Dr. Lee could see his own house just 2 doors down, the porch light he'd left on that morning still burning bright. His daughter's bicycle was visible in the driveway, a splash of pink against the gathering dusk. The irony wasn't lost on him, being stopped mere feet from his own home, in a neighborhood where he'd saved the lives of several residents. The tap on his window was sharp and loud, making him flinch despite his preparation. As he lowered the window, the cool evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching rain. Officer Taylor's flashlight beam swept across the car's luxurious interior before settling uncomfortably on Dr. Lee's face. "License and registration," Officer Taylor demanded, his tone making it clear this wasn't a routine traffic stop. His flashlight beam never wavered, creating harsh shadows across the dashboard of the $120,000 vehicle. Dr. Lee could feel the officer's skepticism radiating through the beam of light, a familiar weight he'd carried throughout his professional life. Just then, his phone lit up with a message from a hospital, another emergency case requiring his expertise. But for now, that would have to wait. In this moment, he wasn't Dr. Lee, the renowned surgeon who had pioneered a revolutionary cardiac procedure last year. He was just another driver, trying to navigate a situation that had nothing to do with traffic violations and everything to do with preconceptions. The leather wallet felt unusually heavy in Dr. Lee's hands as he carefully retrieved his license and registration. Years of performing delicate heart surgeries had taught him the value of steady hands, but tonight they trembled slightly as he handed the documents through the window. His hospital ID badge accidentally slipped out alongside them, catching the beam of Officer Taylor's flashlight for just a moment before falling into the shadow of the door. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Taylor commanded, his voice carrying an edge that made the simple request sound more like a threat. The surgical resident's warning from last week echoed in Dr. Lee's mind. There had been several car thefts in the area involving luxury vehicles. But this was his car, his street, his home just yards away. "Officer, I live right there," Dr. Lee said softly, gesturing toward his house while maintaining eye contact through the rearview mirror. "I'm just coming home from my shift at Metropolitan General. I'm a surgeon there." His voice remained steady, professional, the same tone he used to calm anxious patients before major procedures. The officer's response was to grip his flashlight tighter, its beam now directly in Dr. Lee's eyes. I said, "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The word "sir" carried none of the respect it implied. In the distance, the distinctive sound of another police cruiser's engine grew louder. As Dr. Lee carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, his phone buzzed again. The hospital was still trying to reach him, probably about the emergency case. There were precious few cardiothoracic surgeons available tonight, and someone's life might depend on his expertise. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. While he was being treated like a criminal, someone else might be fighting for their life in an operating room that should have been his. The evening air had grown colder, and Dr. Lee's surgical scrubs offered little protection as he stepped out onto the street. His white coat, with its embroidered name and title, was still folded neatly in the passenger seat. He'd removed it earlier, following hospital protocol before leaving the building. Now he wished he'd kept it on. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Taylor instructed as his partner's cruiser pulled up, flooding the scene with more lights. Dr. Lee raised his hands slowly, the gold watch on his wrist, a gift from his team after their 1,000th successful surgery, catching the red and blue flashes. The same watch he checked countless times during lengthy operations was now being eyed suspiciously by the approaching officers. Neighbors' porch lights began clicking on one by one, like a slow-motion domino effect down the street. Behind curtained windows, curious faces appeared and disappeared. Dr. Lee thought about his daughter, hopefully still at her piano lesson, and silently thanked whatever twist of fate had delayed his arrival home. The last thing he wanted was for her to witness this scene. "Can you explain how you came to be driving this vehicle?" the second officer asked, his tone suggesting any answer would be wrong. Dr. Lee's medical training had taught him to stay calm in high-pressure situations, to think clearly when others might panic. But this was different. In the operating room, he was in control. Here, on his own street, just steps from his own driveway, he had none. "I'd own it," he replied simply, knowing that each word needed to be carefully chosen. "I purchased it 3 weeks ago from the dealership on Madison Avenue. All the paperwork is in the glove compartment." His phone buzzed again in his pocket. A third call from the hospital. Someone's heart wasn't waiting for this misunderstanding to be resolved. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, sending leaves skittering across the pavement. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was approaching. But the real storm was already here, unfolding under the harsh glare of police lights, as Dr. Lee stood with his hands raised, watching his rights and dignity slowly erode on the very street he called home. The first drops of rain began to fall as a third police cruiser turned onto the street, its lights cutting through the growing darkness. Dr. Lee's surgical cap was still in his back pocket, light blue, covered in tiny hearts, a gift from a young patient he'd saved last month. Now it served as a silent witness to this unfolding scene, as more officers approached with hands hovering near their weapons. The vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen last week, Officer Taylor announced to his colleagues, though loud enough for Dr. Lee to hear. The surgeon's mind raced to the stack of paperwork sitting in his home office, the bill of sale, insurance documents, even the thank you note from the dealership. All just a few yards away, yet impossibly out of reach in this moment. His phone vibrated again, more urgently this time. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the hospital's number flashing. Someone needed him, someone whose life might depend on the skilled hands currently held up in the air. Dr. Lee took a deep breath, the same way he did before making the first incision in a difficult surgery. "Officers, please," he began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided countless medical teams through complex procedures. "I have all the documentation to prove ownership. But more importantly, I'm being called for an emergency surgery. Someone's life could be at stake." The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through his scrubs, but he remained still, conscious of every movement. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps noting the surgical scrubs, the professional bearing, or the increasing urgency of the phone's vibrations. The officer Taylor stepped closer, his face hardened against any explanation. "Sir, do you realize it's suspicious for someone to be driving a vehicle of this caliber in this neighborhood at this hour?" The absurdity of the statement almost made Dr. Lee laugh. This was his neighborhood, after all. The house 2 doors down belonged to a patient whose triple bypass he performed just last year. The mailbox he was standing next to had his name on it. His daughter's science fair trophy was visible through their front window, catching the reflected police lights. Thunder rolled overhead as another figure emerged from the growing crowd of neighbors. It was his next-door neighbor, still wearing his hospital administration badge. Recognition flickered across his face as he took in the scene, but before he could speak, Officer Taylor had already begun reciting rites that Dr. Lee never thought he'd hear on his own street. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists, the same wrists that had tied thousands of perfect surgical knots, that had held the lives of countless patients in their steady grip. His phone had finally stopped buzzing, and he wondered what would happen to the emergency patient now. Would they find another surgeon in time? Would someone else's life be impacted by this moment of misunderstanding and prejudice? Rain streamed down his face as he was led toward a police cruiser, past neighbors who had shared holidays with his family, past the sidewalk where he taught his daughter to ride her bike, past the maple tree he planted when they first moved in. His feet knew every crack in this pavement, every uneven spot. He had walked this street countless times, but never like this. The growing crowd of onlookers included faces he recognized from hospital fundraisers and neighborhood barbecues. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others pulled out phones to record the scene, and a few seemed to be arguing with the officers. But it was the expression of his elderly neighbor, the retired judge who had always bragged about living next door to one of the city's top surgeons, that hit hardest. The man stood in his doorway, mouth agape, watching as years of professional accomplishments and community respect seemed to dissolve in the falling rain. The back seat of the police cruiser felt cold and foreign, a stark contrast to the operating rooms where Dr. Lee usually spent his evenings. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, creating a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Through the foggy window, he could see more neighbors gathering, their umbrellas forming a dark canopy against the stormy sky. A flash of white caught his eye. Another person in surgical scrubs was running down the street, barely visible through the rain-streaked window. The head nurse from his department, still wearing her surgical cap, was sprinting toward the scene while holding her phone high. She had probably seen the emergency calls going unanswered and traced his car's GPS to find him. "Officers," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing chaotic emergency rooms. "There's been a terrible mistake." Her hospital badge swung wildly as she approached, reflecting the swirling police lights. The officers turned toward her, startled by her sudden appearance and urgent tone. Inside the cruiser, Dr. Lee watched as she pulled up something on her phone, her hands shaking either from the cold rain or from anger, probably both. Several other hospital staff members began arriving, some still in scrubs, others wearing white coats. They must have followed her from the hospital, concerned when their chief surgeon hadn't responded to the emergency calls. The nurse was now showing the officers something on her phone, gesturing animatedly. Even through the closed windows and rain, Dr. Lee could hear fragments of her voice. "Chief of cardiothoracic surgery. Emergency patient waiting. Saved countless lives." Officer Taylor's face changed as he looked at the phone screen, then at the house with Dr. Lee's name on the mailbox, then at the growing crowd of medical professionals gathering in the rain. The realization seemed to hit him in waves, each one washing away a little more of his certainty. More phones were emerging from the crowd, recording the scene. A young resident held up a tablet showing the hospital's website, where Dr. Lee's photo and biography were prominently displayed. Another colleague had pulled up news articles about his groundbreaking surgeries and humanitarian work. The retired judge had made his way to the officers now, his voice carrying the weight of his former profession as he demanded Dr. Lee's immediate release. "I've known him for 5 years," the judge was saying, his hand chopping through the rain-filled air for emphasis. He's performed surgery on half the people on this street. Through the cruiser's window, Dr. Lee could see his daughter's piano teacher pulling up in her car, his daughter in the passenger seat. His heart sank. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. But then something unexpected happened. His daughter didn't cry or scream. Instead, she stood in the rain beside her teacher, her head held high, and began listing for the officers every charitable surgery program her father had started. The nurse was now on her phone, and from the urgent tone of her voice, she was clearly speaking with the hospital administration. Other neighbors had joined in, some recording, others calling what appeared to be local news stations or community leaders. What had started as a simple traffic stop had transformed into a scene that was highlighting not just an injustice, but the deep connections that existed in this community. Inside the cruiser, Dr. Lee's hands, though still cuffed, remained steady. These were the same hands that had held beating hearts, that had given countless people a second chance at life. Now they waited patiently as the truth unfolded outside, demonstrated not through his own words, but through the actions of a community that knew his true character. The truth has a way of demanding attention, and on this rain-soaked evening, it arrived in waves. The head nurse, drenched but determined, had pulled up the hospital's live surgery schedule on her tablet. There, highlighted in red, was the emergency case waiting for Dr. Lee, a critical heart valve replacement for a young patient who'd been airlifted from a rural hospital. "This man isn't just a surgeon," she declared, her voice carrying over the storm. "Last month, he performed 3 back-to-back surgeries during that big highway pileup. He stayed at the hospital for 36 hours straight to save those lives." She turned to Officer Taylor, holding up her tablet so the screen illuminated his face. "And right now, another family is waiting for him, praying he'll be there to save their child." The crowd of medical staff had grown larger, forming a circle of white coats and scrubs around the police cruiser. A respiratory therapist stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. 2 years ago, my mother needed emergency heart surgery. Every other surgeon said it was too risky. Dr. Lee operated for 8 hours and saved her life. She's alive today because of him." Officer Taylor's partner was now scrolling through his phone, his eyes widening as he read article after article about Dr. Lee's achievements. The local paper's coverage of the new cardiac care wing, medical journal features about his innovative surgical techniques, community service awards, photos of him teaching at the medical school. Inside the cruiser, Dr. Lee watched as realization spread across the officers' faces like the growing puddles on the street. His daughter had moved closer to the car, protected from the rain by an umbrella held by one of his surgical residents. The look in her eyes wasn't of shame or fear. It was pride. The hospital administrator, still in his suit from a board meeting, was now on the phone with the police chief. His free hand gestured at the Mercedes, then at Dr. Lee's house, then at the gathering of healthcare workers who had abandoned their posts to support their colleague. The administrator's voice carried decades of authority. "Do you realize we have a child waiting for emergency surgery while you have our chief surgeon handcuffed in a police car?" Thunder rolled overhead as Officer Taylor's face transformed from skepticism to shock, then to something that looked like shame. The nurse was showing him more photos on her phone. Dr. Lee in the operating room, Dr. Lee accepting awards, Dr. Lee volunteering at the free clinic downtown. But it was the last photo that seemed to hit hardest. Dr. Lee at the hospital's annual fundraiser, standing next to Officer Taylor's own mother, who had been a patient just 6 months ago. The retired judge had managed to get through to the district attorney, who was reportedly already on his way. But it was the arrival of another vehicle that changed everything. A hospital transport van pulled up, its emergency lights cutting through the rain. Inside was the grandmother of the young patient awaiting surgery. She stepped out into the rain, walker and all, her voice trembling but clear. "Please, we've been waiting for hours. My grandson needs Dr. Lee." The weight of the moment pressed down heavier than the storm clouds above. Here was a man who had devoted his life to saving others, regardless of their background, regardless of their appearance, regardless of their assumptions about him. And now, those whose lives he had touched were returning that dedication, standing in the rain to testify to his character. Officer Taylor's hands shook slightly as he reached for his keys. The truth had become impossible to ignore, illuminated by the combined light of dozens of phones, tablets, and most importantly, the gathered faces of a community that knew exactly who Dr. Lee was. The real question now wasn't about the ownership of a luxury car. It was about how such a profound misunderstanding could have occurred in the first place. The handcuffs removal left no visible marks on Dr. Lee's wrists, but their impact lingered in the air like the remaining storm clouds. Within minutes, he was rushing to the hospital in the passenger seat of the head nurse's car, his own Mercedes left parked in the driveway where it should have been all along. His hands, steady as ever, were already going through the mental checklist for the emergency surgery ahead. Back on his street, the scene was transforming. News vans were beginning to arrive, their bright lights pushing back against the darkness that had nearly swallowed a man's dignity. The hospital administrator was giving a statement, his words measured but firm. Tonight, we witnessed both the worst and the best of our community. While Dr. Lee is now doing what he does best, saving lives, we must address why this happened in the first place. The video clips were already spreading across social media. A respected surgeon in handcuffs. A community rising to his defense. A grandmother pleading for her grandson's life. The hospital's PR team was overwhelmed with calls from national news networks, all wanting to know how one of the city's most prominent surgeons could be treated like a criminal steps from his own home. Inside the precinct, Officer Taylor sat at his desk, watching his body camera footage with a growing sense of unease. Every assumption, every biased decision played back in stark clarity. The chief of police stood behind him, arms crossed, watching the same footage. 20 years on the force, the chief said quietly, and this is not who we're supposed to be. The district attorney arrived at the hospital just as Dr. Lee was scrubbing in for surgery. He wanted to take a statement, but there was no time. A young life hung in the balance. Your statement can wait, the head nurse told him firmly. A child's heart cannot. The DA was left to watch through the operating room window as the surgeon who had been in handcuffs an hour ago now held a scalpel with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. Social media exploded with support. Medical professionals from across the country shared their own similar experiences. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with former patients calling to share stories of how Dr. Lee had saved their lives or the lives of their loved ones. Each story was a testimony not just to his skill as a surgeon, but to his character as a human being. The retired judge next door had already drafted a formal complaint to the Police Oversight Committee. His hands, which had signed countless verdicts over the years, now typed furiously on his laptop, documenting every detail of what he had witnessed. It's not enough to be angry, he told the gathering of neighbors in his living room. We need to ensure this never happens again. Officer Taylor's body camera footage was now required viewing at the police academy. But it wasn't just the moment of the arrest that instructors focused on, it was the aftermath. The community's response, the revealed truth, the cost of assumptions. Future officers would learn not just from the mistake, but from the wave of change it inspired. The young patient's surgery was a success, much to his grandmother's relief. As she hugged Dr. Lee afterward, her tears carried more weight than usual. You didn't just save my grandson, she whispered. You showed us all what dignity looks like. The surgeon simply nodded, his surgical cap still on, his stance unwavering despite the exhaustion of the longest night of his career. As dawn broke over the city, the story had reached national headlines. But it wasn't just another tale of injustice. It was a story of community, of truth prevailing, of change beginning. The Mercedes still sat in Dr. Lee's driveway, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but a reminder that appearances never tell the whole story. 3 months after that rainy night, Dr. Lee stood at a podium in the police academy's main lecture hall. The audience before him wasn't filled with medical students eager to learn about cardiac procedures. Instead, rows of police cadets sat attentively, their notebooks open, their faces serious. This wasn't the path he had expected his career to take, but sometimes the most important changes come from unexpected moments. I could have filed lawsuits, he began, his voice carrying the same steadiness it held in the operating room. I could have demanded resignations. I could have let anger guide my response. He paused, looking at the faces before him. Young officers in training who would soon make their own split-second decisions on dark streets. Instead, I chose to be part of the solution. The training program he had helped develop was already showing promise. Officer Taylor, who had led the wrongful arrest that night, now sat in the front row. His badge was temporarily suspended, but rather than fight the suspension, he had volunteered to share his perspective with every new class. "I've spent 20 years learning how to spot suspicious behavior," Officer Taylor would tell them. "What that night taught me, I needed to learn how to spot my own biases first." The changes rippled beyond the police academy. The hospital had established a community outreach program, bringing healthcare professionals and law enforcement together for monthly meetings. They shared stories, challenged assumptions, and built bridges between two groups that often saw each other at their worst moments. The retired judge from next door had helped draft new departmental policies, ensuring that similar incidents would face proper scrutiny. Dr. Lee's daughter had turned her school project into a documentary about that night, interviewing neighbors, police officers, and hospital staff. Her young voice carried a wisdom beyond her years as she asked tough questions about prejudice and perception. The video had gone viral, reaching police departments across the country. "My dad saves lives," she said in the closing scene. "That night, our community saved his dignity." The emergency surgery patient from that evening had made a full recovery. His grandmother became a regular speaker at community forums, her story serving as a powerful reminder of what was at stake when bias interfered with duty. If they had held Dr. Lee any longer, she would say, "I might have lost my grandson. Instead, I gained a whole new understanding of what community means." Officer Taylor's body camera footage had become more than just evidence. It was now a teaching tool. Police academies across the state used it to demonstrate how quickly assumptions could escalate and how deeply they could wound. But they also used the footage of what followed. The community's response, the revelation of truth, and the change that began in its wake. The Mercedes still sat in Dr. Lee's driveway, but now it carried a different symbolism. Local kids would point it out. "That's Dr. Lee's car. He's the one who changed things." Some officers from that night had become regular volunteers at the hospital's free clinic, working alongside the medical staff they had once viewed with suspicion. Small steps, perhaps, but meaningful ones. In the end, the story could have been one of division, of anger, of lawsuits and accusations. Instead, it became a story of transformation. Dr. Lee still performed surgeries, still saved lives, but now he saved something else too. The possibility that the next traffic stop might end differently, that the next assumption might be challenged, that the next bias might be recognized before it caused harm. As he concluded his lecture that day, a cadet raised her hand. "How do you not feel angry when you think about that night?" she asked. Dr. Lee smiled, the same gentle smile he gave nervous patients before surgery. "Because every day, I see the change it created. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best progress, if we're brave enough to learn from them."